Welcome to Plotline Rundown, where we look at classic comic book plotlines and give you a summary so you can pick up on modern references to them. Also, hopefully go out and read them yourself. One of the most enigmatic figures in the DCU is Swamp Thing. At once human and alien, Swamp Thing has for many years been the embodiment of living strangeness, both part of our world and yet entirely outside of human experience in most ways. Watching Dr. Alec Holland try to retain his humanity while also embracing the green to more fully realize his powers is at once triumphal and deeply weird. And it doesn't get much weirder than with Alan Moore writing. In 1984, before Watchmen changed the way that we saw comic books, Moore began writing for Swamp Thing and really started with a bang, writing a multi-part series that took Dr. Holland on a trip through dimensions and worlds that mirrored Dante's Divine Comedy. It was brilliant on a number of levels, and not what we're going to discuss here. What we're going to talk about instead is the next storyline, called American Gothic. This story established a lot of what Swamp Thing would be known for, started to flesh out the Virgil analog first introduced in the last story known as John Constantine, and would establish the mystical plot that would be going on in the background of the Crisis on Infinite Earths. It's also the build-up to the landmark 50th issue of Swamp Thing, so it's very important stuff. And since I mentioned Constantine, it should be noticed that this is the storyline that the show, running on NBC as of the time of this video, is very loosely based on. Before the edits to the pilot that introduced Zed instead of Liv, it was much clearer of a connection with Liv standing in for Swamp Thing, being led around by John. Now we have John stumbling around on his own, much less secure in his knowledge of the situation than the original end of the pilot would suggest. It's still good, but the connections are tenuous, and we're really just going to go over the plotline because it's classic and amazing. So, without further ado, the stats. Main heroes. We have Swamp Thing, John Constantine, Abby Arcane to a lesser extent, and almost every mystical hero in the DCU by the time we get to the end of this. Main villains. A number of classic supernatural creature types, vampires, werewolves, etc., and eventually a cult called the Brujeria. Number of issues, 14. This is in Swamp Thing number 37 through 50. Barrier to entry. Again, this is my rating for how easy it is for somebody who knows very little about the comics to pick it up, from low being a first issue to impossible being a major event like the Crisis on Infinite Earths. American Gothic is on the high end of medium. If you don't know what the Green is, who Alec Holland and Abby Arcane are, or at least have an idea of the Crisis, it might take a little while to connect with the characters. That being said, because Moore changed so much in this run, many of the powers and concepts that are integral to Swamp Thing get introduced to the reader as Alec learns them, so you should be fine. Issue 1 opens with Abby Arcane eating carrots in the sexiest way I have ever seen. There's a seed growing, and they're talking about her husband in a coma, who, by the way, is not Swamp Thing. Considering her boyfriend is a plant, I can't help but think of the phallic implications of this scene, and since it's Alan Moore, I might not be far off. Having wasted day 1 on nothing, we go to day 2, where John Constantine has wandered into somebody else's acid trip. He's talking with his friend Judith, telling her, he's coming back. And her babbling before replying that she knows, it's coming back. Important distinction. Day 3, we see Swamp Thing, having died in the last issue, slowly growing again and becoming self-aware. Back to Constantine, who I guess has been waiting 24 hours for Judith to finish her drink before leaving the hippest disco on the Death Star. Abby finds the sprout that will one day be her sliming love, then back to John, who... You know what? This happens a lot. The scene cuts back and forth between Swamp Thing growing again and John meeting people to talk to them cryptically. John sees a guy with a speech impediment, Sister Grumpy Cat, and eventually gets British all over this artist woman. Swamp Thing eventually grows his narration bulbs, and we're able to have him explain how very alien and plant-like everything is. Done. Finally, John ends up in the swamp where the titular Thing hangs out and offers to tell him more about who and what he is if only Alec meets him in Rosewood, Illinois in 1 week. It's important to note that he doesn't promise he'll do this. In fact, he flat out says he probably won't tell Swamp Thing anything, a point that our hero seems confused about later, but he implies that he might, which is enough to get the big dumb plant monster interested. The issue ends with a pink man in a loincloth with his head turned around backward, jumping out of the closet of the artist woman John was being so very English at before, and chasing her out the window, while the other people Constantine visited freak out for no apparent reason all over the world. It's actually pretty creepy, I admit, and credit to Rick Veitch for a genuinely unsettling monster design. Also, Charles Foster Swamp Thing obsesses over what John told him, much to Abby's dismay.
Rosewood.
Issue 2 starts with a number of boys playing in a lake, intercut with Swamp Thing saying goodbye to Abby, who had just spent nearly 2 weeks feeding and watering him. This is actually a beautiful juxtaposition of pain and joy that eventually ends with the fat kid, of course, being attacked by something under the surface that leaves him pure white before he's dragged down by punk Nazi fishmen. Again, shout out to artists Stan Walk and John Tottleben, who took the lead on this one. The last thing we see is that Rosewood, Illinois is actually at the bottom of the lake before the dueling narrators start fighting over scene supremacy. Thankfully, all 4 of them are in different colors, and the one talking about the guy whose name is on the cover wins. Back to Abby for the obligatory best friend doesn't know how right she is scene, and then we're back to John, who turns into Fade Routha and scares the hell out of a random guy trying to fight him in a bar. I'll be watching you. Back in Rosewood, Nikki's friends look for him while at the bottom of the lake we're introduced to the Mother, a creature so bloated and fat that she cannot hunt and relies on her punk Nazi fishmen children to bring her what turns out to be blood. Swamp Thing learns that he can abandon old bodies and simply grow new ones any place there's some plant material, so he spends a few hours growing himself in Rosewood, eventually getting big enough to do his own narration. And really, can't we just get the other guy back, because all this speaking in ellipses gets really old really quick. Constantine is waiting for him and tells him the reason why they were in Rosewood was that Swamp Thing dealt with some vampires there 2 years before, and when he broke the dam, killing the vamps in running water, he didn't get them all. Now they were hiding beneath the lake where there's no sun to speak of, and the mostly stagnant water protects them, so pretty clever. Nikki's friend Howard keeps looking for him, eventually finding the very white Nikki, who tries to convince him to go into the water. Howard, being a very stupid boy, doesn't notice the glowing red eyes and Nikki's new goth friends rising from the lake until it's too late. We're thankfully spared anything other than the implication and description of punk Nazi fish sex, and Swamp Thing first incorrectly identifies what John said as a promise to tell him stuff rather than, the exact opposite. For a former scientist, Alec Holland can be really dumb. They fight over this, and the issue ends with Swamp Thing letting John go and heading into the lake to deal with the vampire problem he didn't handle right the first time. Issue 3 begins with one of Nikki's friends being enhanced interrogated by his father to get information about Nick and Howard. The parents decide to start a search party, and the audience gets to hope that Dad of the Year meets the punk Nazi fish squad by the end of the issue. Swamp Thing, meanwhile, is walking down the flooded streets of Rosewood as nonchalantly as the goddamn Terminator, while aquatic vampires keep popping up around him.
I am the who and you call who's there. I am the wind blowing through your hair.
He casually beats them off, aided by the fact that he has no blood, so they can't do much to him. He heads to the place where all small-town Midwestern life begins, the high school football stadium. On land, Nicky is aw-shucksing his way around explaining to Howard that it's not so bad being the first meal of a brood of aqua vampires. Nicky knows a lot about vampire taste for having been turned hours ago and never eaten more than the ROUS we see him chomp on. They must have rushed him through orientation. At the football stadium, the aqua vampire eggs must have had 1-hour gestation periods, because they're hatching as Swamp Thing arrives. The first thing the swarm of deadly creatures do is start attacking one another while Twisted Sister watches on in horror. Eventually, only a single, huge fish monster remains to casually give biology the bird. Swamp Thing briefly fights the creature from the 50-yard line and is torn to pieces, allowing the monster to surface. He misses out on eating poor, dumb Howard, but he eats a few of the parents that rescued the boy, including Father of the Year. While this is happening, we learn that Swamp Thing did not die. He instead became the whole hillside and lifted his chest so the water flowed again, either killing the vampires by moving or exposing them to sunlight as Rosewood is brought to the surface. Constantine tells Swampy that while he took care of the vamps, the fact that some people got away to tell the story means the job was botched. You see, the objective seems to have been for somebody, though we don't know who, to increase belief in vampires just a little bit more than already existed. All they needed was somebody to spread the story. John tells Swampy that he can make up for this screw-up by doing a job in 2 weeks in Kenneskook, Maine. Issue 4 begins in the supermarket, with a woman buying pads, while the narration discusses old traditions of sending women to places called Red Lodges during their periods, and already I can tell this is going to be a heavy hand day. The metaphor flows thick and freely in this one, but not a lot actually happens, so I'm going to gloss over most of it. Swamp Thing and Abby talk about John and how they wish they were as cool as he is. Or how he's untrustworthy scum and why is a great big powerful plant monster letting a blonde dude with a smoking problem lead him around. One of the two. Swampy says he'll do this one more job, then he'll quit. He swears. Back in Maine, the woman from before is cleaning up at a dinner party while her boyfriend drops casual misogyny and racism like he's just created a new Twitter sock puppet, explaining that their house is where the Red Lodge used to stand. At least he thinks so, but having never read a book before, he can't be too sure. The male side of their company calls his wife, who I think is Aunt May, fat in a roundabout way, and eventually all of the metaphor crashes on our poor pro/antagonist, turning her into a werewolf in one of the coolest transformations I have seen in comics. I'm reasonably certain there are people who actually think this happens when women get PMS. The woman, Phoebe, goes after her husband and runs into Swamp Thing. It's a short fight, with Swampy thrown into a wall, but even free to kill her douche-tastic husband, she doesn't. She instead rushes through town destroying symbols of domesticity and patriarchy until Swamp Thing tries to talk her down. When she realizes she cannot escape the structural oppression she faces, she impales herself on a display of kitchen knives, reverting to her human form again. Swampy brings her outside, giving her back to the moon. I hate to make fun of this issue because there really is a lot going on, but very little with bearing on the story. More like to have these sort of asides at times to use the established universe to explore a concept. In this case, what we would call microaggressions and embedded misogyny today. It's a bit ham-handed at times, but it gets the point across. Everywhere is the Red Lodge. The issue ends with Swamp Thing telling Constantine that he's going home to Louisiana, which suits John just fine because that's where the next job is. Issue 5 is potentially my favorite of the run. It takes place in an old estate where something terrible happened years before that we learn about over the course of the book. The estate is overrun with actors, since it's to be the main location of a new TV show set in the antebellum South. Already we're getting personality clashes, from the casually racist Angela to the recovering coke addict Billy, neither of whom wants to work with the other. Richard, the well-meaning co-star, doesn't seem to be able to hold either of them back. While that groundwork is laid, Alec and Abby are walking through the swamp when they find a dead bird that Alec casually just absorbs into himself so that it can rot and feed him. Gross. They've been discussing the nature of being him and asking whether it means anything for him to abandon a body so he can grow another. They never come to a conclusion. Back on set, strange things are happening. The actors very slowly start to get into their parts, but they're getting the lines just a little wrong. It doesn't take long to realize that Billy, Angela, and Richard are being taken over by the spirits of the previous owners, reenacting the terrible night that the lady of the house was caught having sex with a slave, and her husband tied him in the basement and skinned him alive. I could honestly do 10 minutes of talking just on the line, "Keep away from the white lines," and its various meanings to the story. The racial message is subtle but clear. The artwork is amazing and contributes to the atmosphere. The issue ends when the actors are fully taken over by the spirits, ready to reenact that final, fateful night. Issue 6 starts with us underground with a corpse narrating to us, which is still easier to read than Swamp Thing's narration. Swamp Thing has shown up for the dead to rise and throw around buzzwords like they're at a Tea Party rally. The salt circle around the cemetery has been broken so the dead can exit at will. Abby gets to the house, but Angela/Charlotte tells her that Richard/Wesley has skinned Billy/William with a knife. Richard/Wesley stabs Abby and leaves her to die. Fortunately, the knife is a prop, so not only is Abby okay, Billy likely couldn't have been skinned with it. Outside, Richard/Wesley confronts the zombies, one of which he killed the last time this played out. Swamp Thing takes the shotgun shot instead, getting knocked back into a bonfire, then walking into the house to set it ablaze, ending the cycle. The issue ends with one of the zombies having stolen a truck off set and going to watch a zombie movie, eventually getting a job selling tickets at the theater. Issue 7 is a Swamp Thing light issue with very little to do with the plot. A vegetable of some sort falls off of Swamp Thing and some hippie dude picks it up. Turns out the guy's a drug dealer and ends up selling parts of the swamp veggie to a guy whose wife is dying in agony and just needs something to take away the pain, and a man who threatens him to get a piece. Both have experiences reflective of their natures. I don't want to go into this much since it has little bearing on the plot, but it is a good issue with incredible artwork and a meditation on human nature that is worth the read. Issue 8 opens in a bar with a guy wistfully describing people based on random numbers. It's kind of like Cylon romance. But that's just a teaser, and we move immediately to Abby's place, where her pipes are clogged with her boyfriend. Swamp Thing thought it'd be nice to visit Abby at her place for once, which doesn't work out very well, and he leaves pouting. Back at the bar, Constantine reminds us that DC was building up to a major event, and we get a cameo from Batman to boost sales. "Hi, Dark Knight! I've never seen you so befuddled before!" Once again, delving into the creepy, we get a shot of somebody helping another person through the woods, only to find out that the other person, which we only see the eyes of, thinks that he killed the boogeyman and has replaced him.
Egad! It's him.
The helpful man is strangled to death by the boogeyman, who we learn is the man from the bar, and each description attached to the number was somebody that he has already killed. Swamp Thing finds the body and chases the boogeyman through the swamp, scaring him to death. Alec ends the issue wondering where Constantine is, since he had seen more than madness in the man's eyes. The last thing we see is Abby reading a Clive Barker book and freaking out when the phone rings. It's Constantine letting her know that Alec has one more stop to make before it's all over. San Miguel, California in 1 week. Issue 9 begins and ends with the sound of hammers. Two men start shooting each other, and it's like the dueling ghosts on the haunted mansion. They keep getting hit and keep shooting. We're then introduced to the standard group of horror movie teens, played by people in their 30s by tradition, and apparently their principal. Honestly, it's two couples, but one of these is not like the other. They share a story about Amy Cambridge, the heiress to a fortune made with firearm sales. She went mad and tried to make up all the death caused by her family, having been told by the ghosts of those killed with Cambridge repeaters that, quote, the sound of hammers must never stop. She built and built on her house until she died. Now the house is supposedly haunted. Of course, the 30-year-old teenagers are all skeptics to one level or another, and Dave, the principal-looking guy, is the only believer in all sorts of mystical stuff. Despite Dave's warnings, they enter the haunted house and split up to explore it, making them dumber than the average horror cast. Dave watches as his wife goes running off with his friend and eventually even loses the one remaining person. At this point, we're taking bets on how long the douchebag lives. Dave's wife, Linda, and Rod seem to die in horrible ways, with Rod seduced by a corpse and Linda overrun by firing squad victims. Judy, the other girl, gets run over by a herd of buffalo stampeding through a wardrobe. You heard me. Dave knocks on wood for help, which happens to coincide with when Swamp Thing arrives, making the superstitious Dave think he's a wood elemental responding to the knock. Swamp Thing works his way through the house and finds that Linda is still alive, though Rod and Judy have both died. He saves Linda and figures out that banging on wood in the house drives the ghosts away. Ultimately, Dave and Linda escape the house, and Linda mourns the death of her lover in front of her husband. Constantine shows up and introduces Alec to several of the people we saw in the first few issues. John finally promises to show Alec the truth that he's been looking for. The issue ends with Dave buying a rifle at a gun shop, and narration that he plans to, quote, have a little talk with Linda. That's when we're reminded of what else is called a hammer. Issue 10 has Batman, Hawkman, and the Phantom Stranger standing behind Swamp Thing, who is towering over the corpse of a dinosaur. That sounds awesome! Man, I wish that happened in this issue. Things open with a quote from the Book of Revelation, which is incorrectly called Revelations here. Sorry, personal pet peeve. Constantine shows Swamp Thing a street where pirates are stabbing spacemen, an evil Batmobile is running people down, a giant squid has appeared in the middle of the city, and... Wait a minute. Damn it, Moore, what is it with you and city-dwelling giant squid? He and Swamp Thing are teleported, Constantine, not the giant squid, to a space station where we're drawn directly into the Crisis on Infinite Earths plotline. If you don't know this one, the basic idea is that the DC multiverse had gotten too unwieldy, so the company came up with a plot to crush all their alternate timelines down to one. In this case, Alexander Luthor is leading the charge to try and save at least one Earth from the Crisis. The room is full of heroes, but the only one we get to talk to is the Phantom Stranger, who knows Swamp Thing and explains that the physical crisis would have spiritual implications, and Alec would be needed to help protect the mystical planes from destruction. This conversation also makes reference to the events in Newcastle and John being in a mental institution, both of which are plot points in the Constantine show. Swamp Thing wants to see for himself, so he's teleported back to Earth and looks at everything through the green while Moore throws words at us. For example, who, what, from where? Just throwing words at us doesn't mean anything, comic. They have to have context. And this trend continues for a while as Constantine explains who the Brujeria are, a South American cult that wants to use the Crisis to remake the world that they want. They've been trying to increase belief in the supernatural in order to give themselves more power. This was why it was so bad when Swamp Thing failed to stop the story of the vampires from getting out when he clearly stopped the vampires, for example. We also learn of the Invuche, which is the creature that creeped me the hell out in the first issue. It's the guardian of the cave where the Brujeria live, and even Constantine has a hard time talking about it. Regardless, they plan on bringing back a horrible creature that nobody is quite sure what it is, and use that creature to assault and take over heaven, and Swamp Thing must stop them. But first, Constantine must bring Swamp Thing to the Parliament of Trees, which was a new concept at this point. The issue ends with Sister Grumpy Cap failing to find Judith in London and taking the Underground, but being tricked into getting off at the wrong station where she's murdered by the Invuche. Issue 11 opens with a photographer talking about some pictures he got in the swamp of a young woman with white hair having sex with a slime monster of some sort. Papers turn him down for the most part, assuming it's a guy in a suit. In South America, we see John Constantine has changed his clothing for the first time ever. He introduces Swamp Thing to several natives that seem to like him quite a bit. They lead Alec to the Parliament of Trees, which they guard with their lives. Swamp Thing is overwhelmed by the age of these trees, all of whom are retired Earth Elementals. They all were once like him, and he hopes they will teach him how to stop the threat from the Brujeria, but they all get first-year philosophy on him and ask how he can know that the people trying to take over heaven are evil. They cryptic at him and refuse to talk anymore. In the end, we find out that one of the papers did run with the pictures of Abby and Alec because the editor recognized Abby from work, and since she works with children, being caught having what is at least very kinky sex was enough to set this douche off. Issue 12, coming to the endgame. Constantine meets up with his surviving friends, Frank and Judith. They have to get to the cave of the Brujeria the old-fashioned way due to spells on it, and Swamp Thing shows up either armored for battle or dressed for a Gatsby party. They stumble into the cave and have to split up, which is very bad for John, who runs into the Invuche, which easily knocks him out. Alec is trying to get in through the green, but that doesn't work either, so we leave him to see Judith inappropriately coming onto Frank, and Frank inappropriately accepting. Guys, I get that sex is awesome, but the fate of heaven relies on you getting through this exceptionally creepy cave full of things trying to kill you. A little bit of focus would not go amiss. The Brujeria wake up John, who is in a pit, and reveal to him that Judith was on their side the whole time. The cult promised to turn her into a bird, one of the few things they'll do with women, and she was dumb enough to accept. She would be a messenger, there to bring all the fears, uncertainties, and superstitions of humanity to the first darkness, convincing it to come over to our world and smash the throne of heaven. The Brujeria start a ritual to turn Judith into their messenger, while the pit John is chained in starts to fill with water. Or mud. Or something that will kill him, I don't know. Meanwhile, Swamp Thing finds a foothold into the cave through the green, a flower that he sent in with Judith, and grows a new body inside. Man, if I was looking at something with that look on its face, I would immediately quit whatever I was doing and run. John Tuttleben nailed this page. Constantine tells Swampy to stop the ritual, but the big, dumb slime monster just doesn't listen and saves Constantine's life instead, allowing now Bird Judith to fly to another dimension with a pearl made of humanity's collective nightmares off to deliver it to the first darkness. And in case that's too much excitement, we get to go back to see Abby get fired and the police arrest her for something. Having sex with a swamp monster that they believe is a swamp monster but nobody else will, I suppose. This whole section is absurd. Did they plan to convince a grand jury or a prosecutor to bring charges of, I guess, bestiality with an anthropomorphic collection of slime and vines? We won't see the payoff to this in this storyline, so drink up the pointlessness, people. Issue 13 starts with Swampy tearing through the Brujeria like it ain't no thing, and I have to keep reminding myself not to try to use slang. He and John escape the cave. We see Constantine once again dressed in something other than his signature trench, telling somebody the story of what happened there. He's talking to Baron Winters, trying to get him to let John and his magic squad use his house. At first, Winters says no, but when John mentions that Sargon's on board, Winters changes his tune. Eventually, we see several other mystical DC characters answering the call, including Doctors Fate and Occult. We get a pointless cameo from the endlessly useless Cain and Abel. Why did DC insist on using these characters? Swamp Thing heads to the Land of the Dead to recruit the Phantom Stranger, Dead Man, and eventually the Spectre, which impresses everybody. John nets Sargon by telling him Baron Winters volunteered his house, which was actually true at this point, and finally we top it all off in the Land of the Living with getting Zatara and his daughter Zatanna involved, also finding out the latter has been secretly seeing John. In the Land of the Dead, Swampy pulls in help from Etrigan, the rhyming demon. Not being a huge DC fan, I don't get this character. When he's not in the room, everybody talks about what a monster he is and how evil, but I've never seen him do anything but find excuses to side with the good guys. Is that a thing? Is that like his thing? If you know, mention it in the comments. The last thing they need is Mento, the psychic bridge maker. He can use his silly-looking hat to connect the Circle of Wizards to the Land of the Dead so they can magic all the magic. The issue ends with the Judith bird delivering all our nightmares to the first darkness, which starts to rise just outside of hell. Our last issue, which is issue 50 of Swamp Thing, the tie into the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and larger than a normal book. Lots happens here, I'll stick to the highlights. We start with Cain and Abel, and I still don't care. They serve no purpose. An army of demons, Swamp Thing and Dead Man, march to a hill so they can stay in place and philosophize for a moment. This is the payoff for all of Moore's hints at deeper meaning, and while it's good, it also drags down the action significantly while the good guys wait for the first darkness to do something. The Circle of Mystics back on Earth join hands, and it's made clear that they cannot let go or everyone dies. Mento is frightened, but without him everything is lost, so John lies to keep him calm, and they get going. Etrigan armors up, which is kinda cool in concept, except he looks nothing like he did even an issue ago, so I'm not sure why I cared until he gives his name. The demons of hell are pretty much split between the good guys and the first darkness, but the rhymers are all with the light, and apparently there's nothing more terrifying in hell than couplets, so this is a good thing. Everyone shows up and waits. And waits. And waits. Until the first darkness turns into a tornado and everybody joins the battle. Etrigan goes first, thinking of slicing a tornado with a sword, but somehow that doesn't work. He's instead taken inside and interrogated, teaching the first darkness the concepts of fatalism and inevitability, which sounds like a really bad idea. Etrigan is spit out. The same thing is repeated with Dr. Fate, who teaches the darkness contempt by not even accepting that they can speak like equals, and the Spectre, who unwittingly teaches it vengeance. Nobody teaches it a thing called love. They're not doing well, in the Mystic Circle both Sargon and Zatara have been burned alive. Things are looking bleak when Swamp Thing voluntarily enters the darkness, nobody having thought to cast magic missile at it, and treats it like a person, answering its questions honestly. It doesn't help, but the darkness lets Swamp Thing leave. When all seems lost, Moore gives us just one more heartbreaking moment when they realize the giant tornado that they've been fighting is literally just a finger of the first darkness, which reaches up and clasps a giant hand made of light ending everything with the power of friendship. Seriously, that's how it ends. Mento's left crazy. Everyone goes their separate ways, and the mystical world feels just a little bit different, and that's it. Despite a rather disappointing end, this is still one of the better storylines written for DC. It's rich in metaphor and ambitious in concept. Seemingly disparate plot threads and ideas tie back into one another neatly, and so much of what is commonly understood about Swamp Thing was established in these pages. So, what did we learn? Swamp Thing can shed his body and reappear anywhere there is something vaguely plant-like. Constantine cannot be trusted, but he's usually on the right side. Earth elementals retire to the Parliament of Trees and become douchebags. The laws in Louisiana are a bit vague re swamp monster sex. When the fate of the multiverse is at stake, Swamp Thing literally has better things to do. That's it for this American Gothic plotline rundown. If there's a comic book plotline you want me to cover here, leave it in the comments. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe.